I was really mean to my Canon R5, but I decided it was worth it to check out the claims about the new firmware 1.6, and if it lives up to what it's saying it can do. Canon just recently released firmware version 1.6 for the Canon R5. And the most important thing about it is this is supposed to address the central controversy of the R5 that's been around since the beginning. And that is the overheating issues of this brilliant little camera. And 1.6 is supposed to really allow us as users to skirt around those very practical, frustrating limitations that exist in the Canon R5. Now, I was extremely excited when I heard about 1.6 and immediately went out there. I have a very busy schedule right now, but started conducting a lot of tests on the camera. Now, as I started doing my tests, I started to see YouTube videos coming out where other people were doing the same thing. And I really recommend, if you're interested in seeing a really broad range of tests, to go check out Ordinary Filmmaker. I'll put a link down below, but he's got a great YouTube channel. Honestly, I love all of his information he puts out. I kind of my little go-to to find out little things about camera rumors and everything like that. And he has done some really great R5 1.6 firmware tests on overheating in 8K RAW, 4K 120, all those things. I really recommend using that as a resource as well because this channel is great anyway, and you're really gonna love those tests. Now for me, as I got ready to punish my Canon R5 with this firmware, I wanted to focus on the 3 formats that I consider the most practical for me. That's what mattered to me. That's what I was gonna spend my time testing on. And the first one by far is 4K HQ on the Canon R5. Now, if you know anything about 4K HQ, that is the 8K sensor that is downsampled into a 4K image. It gives you a vastly cleaner and crisper 4K image, and I find this to be by far the best and most practical shooting format on the Canon R5. And where this really plays in important for me is I have an R5C as well, which automatically downsamples the image and never overheats. And what I want to know is, could I get a 4K HQ image from the Canon R5 as a B camera, especially for interview type setups? This is something that literally comes into my life on an almost weekly basis, and it stands right now, I have not been able to use 4K HQ on my Canon R5 on the B camera because it overheats. I've had to use standard 4K, which never overheats. Now, before I went and did any of my 1.6 firmware, I decided to do some control tests by using the original 1.52 firmware that I had before I updated it. And let's go ahead and take a look here at this firmware as it goes in the old version of the Canon 4K HQ. Now, in the old firmware of the Canon R5, you can see I got the overheating in 4K HQ at 25 minutes and 34 seconds, and then at 28:54, when I tried to start and stop to get around the 30-minute record limit, I can no longer record on the camera. The camera overheated, it would not let me go. I got the red letters of death, which as a Canon R5 user, this is very frustrating. I have practically been in situations where the camera's deciding it's too hot and it won't let me hit record. I've missed shots before, and I really hate that. Now, because 4K HQ is such a critical and important thing for me, this is the one I decided to really beat the tar out of my camera. I had a very hot day. It was 96 degrees Fahrenheit. We had a 71% humidity when I decided to take my camera outside and try this 4K HQ with the 1.6 firmware. Now, on top of it being this hot, it was so humid because it just rained 20 minutes before the test that my camera fogged up before I went out there. So even before I walked outside, I had to take a hairdryer and blow it on the lens to get the lens up to speed. So I already got the camera pretty warm before I even started the test. The other thing about this that I thought was very important, when I shoot, I don't ever really shoot and flip out my back screen. That's just not the way I like to shoot. So I kept that back screen closed to keep even more heat on there. And the other thing that I did do is I did use it with a V-mount with a dummy battery in there. And this for me, in the past, I've done other videos. I can put a link up here. I have done tests to see if the battery changes the heating or overheating on the Canon R5, and it really doesn't have any major effect. So for me, having a dummy battery in there was completely fine because I didn't want to have to keep switching out my battery while I did the test. Now, let's go ahead and see how the 1.6 did in 96 degree heat, 71% humidity, the battery closed, and it's already heated up by a hair dryer. Now, as you can see, I started running the camera. It was very, very hot out there. I was sweating just standing there. And as you can see, the camera kept running and running and running. And as a matter of fact, it went over 2 hours without even giving me a heat warning. Now, I did exceed the 30-minute run limit one time, but immediately kept on going. But honestly, once I reached a 2-hour point without even getting any kind of overheat warning, I figured I'd prove the point that I needed. I have never ever needed to run my camera for 2 hours straight recording nonstop, and the camera did it. Honestly, I picked it up, it was a little warm, took out the card was a little warm, but nothing too crazy. I really don't know how I could have made this test any more evil unless maybe I'd sat out in the sun in Sahara, but with that kind of temperature, 96 degrees, 71% humidity, the camera kept going, and I didn't even get an overheat warning in 4K HQ. So once I moved from that, I decided to do the second most common setting that I like to have on my Canon R5, and that is 4K 60 frames per second. This is a format that I've had to deal with overheating many times on the Canon R5 in real practical situations. I love to use 4K 60 on documentary and commercial work, and I'll be honest, in the field, I've had to deal with that little overheating issue and managing it in an overheating mode. So to set the baseline, I went ahead in my garage at night and I started recording. And as you can see here, 4K 60 overheated and shut down at 32 minutes and 56 seconds, which is pretty much what I experienced practically in the field if you just try and go straight. But once again, because I did want to push and punish my camera, once again, I took it outside for 4K 60 frames per second. The day was a little bit cooler. The temp was 93 degrees with a 59% humidity when I tested it. But the parameters at this time was I made sure once again that the back screen was closed. And because I usually do this frame rate in handheld or in gimbal work, I used an internal battery this time, not a V-mount. In case some of you are wondering, well, maybe the little dummy battery changed it. This time I'm using an internal battery. Let's go ahead and run it again and see what happens. You can see that the camera ran and ran and ran. I actually had to switch out the battery at about an hour and a half, but once I got to the 2-hour mark, I didn't even have an overheat warning at that point. It ran for 2 hours without even giving me an overheat warning. And once again, at 2 hours, I stopped. I felt I had proven my point. There's no reason I would ever need to run for 2 hours straight at 60 frames per second. And the Canon R5 held up fantastic. The camera was a little bit warm, the card was a little bit warm, but I didn't feel there's anything out there that was really off or on about it. It just really feels like I finally unlocked my camera all the way. Now I decided to move on to the last one of my tests in a format that I do occasionally use. It's popped up commercially from time to time, and that is 8K. Now I do want to say this, I never really record 8K RAW on my camera. It's just too clunky, it's too big. It just doesn't make any sense for the commercial work that I do. But I do find myself using 8K All-I, IPB, or honestly IPB a lot too, because it's really so much smaller, lets me get the 8K if I need that resolution, but it's not completely destroying my hard drives. So I decided to do my last test on 8K IPB Lite, which does tax your camera because it is the compression mode. And just so you know, I did all of these at IPB Lite, just in case you're wondering. Now, once again, as our baseline, you can see here, the first test I did with the old firmware, I could get the overheat warning came on at 1643 and the camera shut down at 1955. So you couldn't even get 20 minutes of 8K recording on the old Canon firmware. Updated the firmware, let's go ahead and torture it. Now for this test, I decided to do it in my garage because I knew 8K was gonna push my camera even harder, and honestly, the day was there's a rainstorm coming in. Now, my garage is not recorded. So in my garage right here, it was 86 degrees. Still pretty darn toasty. Not quite the 96 I had outside, but I thought that was still more than warm enough to really push this camera at 8K all the way to the test. Now this one was a little different. I started running it, and as you can see here, the camera did run much longer than it did at 1.5, but at 47:14, the first warning light came on. At 57:04, it turned into red warning line. And then at 1:08, the camera overheated and shut down. Now, in the interest of completely punishing my camera, I gave the camera a 3-minute cooldown time. and started recording again. The camera immediately started recording, but then I ran out of batteries, and then I had a 4-minute window before I changed the battery, but after that I was able to then push the camera to record for another 37 minutes, so I was able to get over 2 hours of record time of 8K footage in that window of time. Now, I will be honest, this was the only one of my torture tests that actually got me worried for my camera. The card in the camera at 8K IPB light was very, very hot. And the scariest part is I could actually smell some scents coming from my camera from the heat that I was pushing on it. Now, I did not experience that in any way, shape, or form in 4K HQ or 4K 60, but the 8K IPB light, man, I felt recording for over an hour straight definitely did do that. Now, that being said, I can't imagine any real world scenario where I'd want to record an hour and 8 straight minutes of anything in 8K. And the camera easily pushed to 47, 50 minutes, really with no problem. And that being said, I think this makes the 8K on the R5 a very, very practical thing if you want a non-RAW setting. Now, if you're interested in 8K RAW, that's not something I wanted to test out because it's not something I actually ever do. But if you're interested in it, I do recommend going back to Ordinary Filmmaker and checking out his links. He did do some great tests on 8K RAW on the Canon R5. And spoiler alert, he was basically able to let it go and run non-stop without the camera overheating. Okay, so now that I spent several days beating up and torturing my camera, what is my final verdict on this firmware update 1.6? Does it deliver what it claims? And the answer, in my opinion, is unequivocally yes. This is an absolute game changer for the Canon R5. As a matter of fact, Canon could have probably released this as an R5 too, and people would have been ecstatic just because it fixes that central overheating issue that was by far the single most frustrating component of the Canon R5. It's an absolutely incredible update. The fact that now you can access all these things on your Canon R5 without worrying about it is just so awesome and really, really exciting. If you've gone out there, I would strongly recommend updating this and really getting essentially a new version of your camera with this firmware update. So kudos to camera. Now, if we could only get rid of that very, very pesky 30-minute record limit, that would be awesome. Anyway, guys, I hope that was helpful. I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. Leave me any comments down below. Yeah, go out there, keep on shooting, and yeah, I'll talk to you soon.